We're talking about crazy encounters. What are some of the craziest or most interesting encounters you've had in D&D? I'm talking battle arenas, avalanches.
I'm thinking of two specific encounters. One of them is I was playing in the Star Wars Edge of the Empire system, and we were on this, I think it was like a jungle type planet, and I just remember Will was DMing, and he described these creatures like climbing in the trees that looked like octopuses. Octopi?
Octopodes?
Oh, I was in that game.
Anyways, yeah, you were there.
Whoa, that's rare.
Yeah, and I just remember just being terrified because there was like seeing an octopus climbing in a tree is just terrifying. Like now they're not in the water; they're just like, and it was definitely an interesting encounter.
Oh yeah, that was really creepy. I think for me in general, like the best encounters I've had have always been either social encounters, but then there's really too many to count. Like weird situations where you're at a party and you like say something wrong, and like, you know, the NPC will be like, "Oh, I didn't know you were from there," and they'll be like, "Oh, like those are my favorites when they're in a social encounter and they say something, they mess up, and it's not like a die roll where they get like a nat 1 on deception. It's like literally the player playing as the character screws up something and it creates this social tension, you know, where everyone has their hand on their holster sort of feel. I
Mexican
love
standoff.
Yeah. Or as the Mexicans would say, a standard standoff.
A standard standoff? Okay, so for mine, this was in a system that I've only played, I think, 4 or 5 times. Blades in the Dark. We've mentioned this before. This is kind of a dark urban fantasy.
With a lot of blades?
And it's very dark. This encounter was really this prolonged scene, and what it was you were infiltrating a dinner party for a really rich and powerful kind of land baron, if I recall, and I think he's secretly a vampire, probably.
Oh, I remember this.
And it was just really cool because the danger is just kind of, it was very present and it's there, and some of the players were sneaking off to go in and search the rooms for the stuff they came to steal, and the system is written in such a way that it really facilitates just ratcheting up the tension, and it worked out very well. And then eventually, of course, things exploded and guns were fired and knives were pulled out, and it went very wrong, as all good heists should. So that was my most memorable encounter. And actually, it's everyone in Blades in the Dark is a kind of rogue, so I think it works very well.
I've probably mentioned this one before, but definitely the most interesting character that I've encountered was one of Will's creations, and it was a character named Allison Doggins, which was literally just a bunch of hot dogs in a mohair sweater. And
brought to life
and
with illusionary magic.
Yes. I think eventually we ate her because she was just hot dogs.
Yeah, that was really kind of gross in a lot of ways. I didn't intend it to go that way. It was just a wizard who looked like he had a traveling posse of very dangerous friends, but it was really just him and a bunch of illusions.
Yeah.
It was like scarecrows, essentially.
Yeah.
And
sometimes scarecrows are made out of hot dogs.
Welcome to Vox Arcana. I'm William.
I'm Jake.
I'm David.
And this is a Dungeons & Dragons podcast, episode 15, Encounter Building.
I have a confession. I don't like the term encounter.
Okay, here we go.
But I love encounters, but the term for me, it just makes me think of
cosmic encounter.
When you're playing, like let's say you're playing Pokemon and you're just like wandering around, and then eventually just someone just pops out of a bush like, fight me, kid. Like that's what I think of, like when I think of an encounter, is
a random encounter.
A random encounter that is forced upon you. So I don't necessarily like that, because a lot of the time the way that I feel GMs interpret it is like you have to have a certain amount of fights per day. So while you're walking along, you randomly encounter 3 alligators and then 3 owlbears.
Owlbears?
Owlbears.
Oh.
So a lot of GMs use it as like a forced fight rather than just an interesting event. In my experience,
I think the
Right.
I think
Yeah,
the
Jake, you
definition
gotta
is fine. Like the term encounter is literally just a point of conflict. And like the three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons that they've kind of really pushed for 5e is exploration, social interactions, and combat. And so oftentimes it just funnels down into combat when you think of like a quick encounter. But when you think of encounters, that is our job as dungeon masters, like, is to come up with encounters, like come up with points of conflict, whether they be exploratory, whether they be social, whether they be combat. They just need to be points of conflict, and creating these encounters is literally where the dungeon master gets to flex most of his or her muscles, you know?
I'm okay with the definition of encounter because it encompasses several different things. That you can't just say that an encounter is combat or encounter is a social thing. We might say interactions, but that seems so bland and like non-interesting. So yeah, I agree with Jake that if you don't have encounters, then you're just having this wide open world, and you say to your players, "Go!" Like, I haven't planned anything specific. You can go get yourself into trouble. And I think some people might like that game, but most people don't. I don't really. So it is up to your players have a goal, a mission, an objective, and you need to put these speed bumps in between them and that, and hopefully they're interesting.
So is it possible to make an encounter without conflict? Like, isn't that the core of what an encounter is? Is it's conflict that you're in a variety of ways
I don't think
pushing
so.
on the players? Okay.
Yes, Jake.
So give me an example.
Agree.
Wait, okay, so Will agrees, David doesn't. David, give me an example of a non-conflict encounter where there's no problem to solve.
So, let me.
I knew it. You can't because it doesn't exist. It's like, and then I just walked across the room and I sat down, and that was my encounter for the day.
No. So you can. So like, let's say you're traveling in a forest, and as you're traveling, you notice up ahead there are 3 owlbears.
Sounds like a regular encounter
It sounds like a regular encounter, but
because it is.
but you don't necessarily have to engage them. It's just like when I think of an encounter, it's something like, and now 3 owlbears are attacking you. This is more of like, this is an event that's happening. Like, you see owlbears crossing the road. Like, what do? And it's like, well,
Yeah, that's still
you
a
can wait
challenge,
for them to
though.
pass,
That's
you can
still a
try to fight
speed
them.
bump. That's still like a conflict, right? Like, you have a
There's
decision
a problem,
to make.
and you choose how to approach it.
Yeah. I think we're on the same page of what an encounter
I guess we are
is.
then, because I'm just like, the way my mind is processing it is a little different.
So David, if I
Yeah.
may interpret your mind for a second.
Yes.
Because what you're saying I agree with, in that random encounters with stuff that just is like, like a Japanese RPG. You're walking through the woods or you're playing Pokemon, right? And then you get a random encounter and you're fighting it. You had no choice, but now you're in a fight. And I don't like that for D&D. In the Hot Springs Island hex crawl that I ran, was that this year? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Whenever you find a random encounter, because they have tons of them to help simulate the ecosystem of this world, it's not just things to fight. Like, sometimes you'll find plants that you can harvest, or if you do find a creature you can fight, it's always engaged in another activity, because the monsters are not waiting around for you to come up so they can fight you. Like, they have lives,
Yeah.
or at least quote unquote lives on the island. They didn't exist before I rolled it on the table. But yeah, I agree with David. Forced fighting is boring, or it can be.
Yeah, I think the key to an exceptional encounter is having those 3 pillars all there. So you see this encounter, like David said, it could be the owlbears, and you have potentially an exploratory way of getting around it, where you can kind of explore and go around the owlbears. You have the straight up combat where you just kill them, or potentially you have a social aspect where maybe the druid or the ranger can talk to the owlbears. And so all 3 of those pillars are present in the encounter, and then you're left, you give it up to the players to decide what to do next, and they can take any of those options and even more.
That's interesting. I've never heard of the exploration as being a encounter type. So, Jay, can you give me a specific example of what that might look like?
So, I think I've garnered kind of a real appreciation for the exploration pillar of the fifth edition D&D, what they're trying to push from running the Tomb of Annihilation when they're on an island and it's just pure jungle and they can explore and like literally that's how they get around. Like there is no easy roadmap, there are no roads to stay on, there isn't like civilization once they get into the jungle and they're forced to try to figure out and creatively get from place to place. And so, yeah, I think this is by and large the hardest pillar of the types of encounters. I think this one is the hardest to implement, but I think it can be very rewarding. And I think it's also it values creativity where if someone wants to try to go around something or even like dig a tunnel under something or try to get to the highest peak so they can see something, like all of these different things, there's like it's almost hard to explain because there's so many options available for exploration that you if you find a creative player, they'll often do well with this.
I don't know if I agree with exploration actually being a type of encounter. I think it's an underlying tool used to build encounters, but it's not necessarily one. So I present a different sort of a list of categories of encounters you can choose from. And I would say it is combat, social, puzzle, and then maybe I would put chase in there because chases can be handled differently in D&D.
Chase encounter?
Yes. I don't run them very often, but there are some interesting rules, I think, in the DMG actually, about how to handle... like you could do a horse chase where you're like battling on horseback, like all kinds of
So how is that different than a combat encounter? Or would that just be a subtype?
Yeah, maybe it's a subtype of combat. But as for exploration, I think that is an option given for any of these. Like you see, let's just say it's a terrain situation, right? Like there's a huge gorge and there's no way to cross.
That's almost a puzzle.
See? And
maybe a puzzle.
And maybe there is the one bridge is guarded by some powerful sphinx or something. You got to answer its riddles that are notoriously impossible to answer. So you can choose the social route and try to overcome that. You can fight it, or you can figure out a way to cross somewhere else, which would be more dangerous. So maybe it's just those three.
Yeah, I feel like getting into the types of encounters or the pillars of what encounters are, it all gets a little fuzzy because it's like a Venn diagram where everything kind of overlaps so much that it's almost ridiculous to have separate circles to begin with, you know? Like, I don't know if the types are as important as like making good encounters.
Yeah, and that's so what makes a good encounter in your opinion, Jake?
Ooh. I think having a variety of outcomes, not a variety of outcomes, having a variety of possibilities, a variety of ways to address it. My favorite encounters are ones that you can address by, sneaking in and stealing something, or you can just kill the person that has it, or you can convince them to give it to you, right? Those are three options, but all of them are viable, and all of them can effectively achieve the goal, but they're all vastly different. And so I love having all those options available. But oftentimes if you're in a dungeon and there's this big iron golem standing in front of a door, it's like, okay, this is combat, and there's really no other way around it. You can't talk with the golem. You can't sneak around it. It's like, okay, this is just combat. And there's really no creative freedom to try other things.
No, I love that. I think that having interesting situations where it is really up to the player to decide how they want to go about dealing with this problem or conflict. So they have to get this gem. Like, how do they do it? Do they steal it? Do they try to fight people to get it? Do they try to negotiate for it? I think that allowing players to decide what they want to do and gives them more agency over the story and how they want to play, and it shows more about who your characters are and the decisions that they make.
So I have just a great revelation based on what you guys are saying. First, Jake pointed out that every encounter needs a goal that is very clear. That is not just, you're having a fight, right? This is a random encounter I made up to stall for time tonight. There's a very clear-cut objective, and you need to get to it. Also, the players understand their options. So, like you're saying, if there's a big golem in your dungeon and there's really only one way through this, that's very limiting. However, I don't think that every problem should be solvable in any way. I think that there's going to be
Yes,
certain
I
situations
completely
where
agree.
you're going to like a social approach is much more appropriate, or even like smarter, and then other times it's going to be one or the other. And that brings me to this idea. This is a rule, I guess, a set of rules from 4th edition called skill challenges. And what this is let's say you are doing a heist or a high-speed chase or something. Let's build a scenario for this real fast. I want to just have a variety of skill challenges. So, David,
Yes.
give me an exciting event that is happening, like in a town.
So you're having a jousting tournament.
Perfect. David or Jake, what is the goal that is not to win the joust? The side goal of why we're really at this jousting tournament.
You're trying to infiltrate the Thieves Guild, who you know is meeting there, and you're trying to overhear a conversation as you're watching the joust.
Interesting. So the way a skill challenge might work is that you set up behind the scenes. I'm going to give you the simplest explanation. Let's say you need 6 successes, like 6 successful rolls from your players before they get to 3 failures. And every skill, or there can be no repeat skills rolled during this thing. So you might have a player who is on a horse jousting.
Yeah.
Yes, and you might have a person sneaking around, like to overhear the Thieves Guild meeting. You have a person distracting somebody, right? And so you're making all your players choose which skill to roll to overcome this. And I think this can give you a nice creative mix of, and you could even be doing a combat, right? You can run the joust like a combat encounter, kind of. You could be running a social encounter off to the side, but it's all kind of one thing that's happening, and you're just cutting around from scene to scene. And I think it's a great way to handle a diversity of skills.
Absolutely. Like, I feel like it almost requires a cinematographer's eye because you kind of like are cutting between scenes and being like, okay, now we cut to this guy and he's doing this. Okay, roll. Okay, yeah. If they do split up, or if not, like, yeah, you can kind of cut between them, and that requires kind of a, I don't know, a certain skill of knowing.
I mean, you can have everybody
and how
together
everything has
at
to
one.
unfold.
You can have everybody in the same area doing something. Let's say they're trying to bust down a reinforced door, and there's a horde of zombies or enemies just coming at them. And so you're trying to get them to get their successes before the 3 failures. And that way you're not having to cut around. But it's a really powerful tool that I'm sort of disappointed that didn't make it into the official 5e rules. But as we all know, rules are meant to be added to in the case of D&D.
Or broken.
Huh.
Or bent a lot.
So my question to you guys would be, when you're building encounters, do you have encounters that you just have set that your adventuring party, the players that you're DMing for, will just go through and address them how they are? Or do you tailor make your encounters for your specific table?
Oh, okay. So you're saying, do I have like a notebook that's just full of like 100 pre-made cookie cutter encounters, and I throw them out when needed, or I customize them as needed, like on the night before in my prep?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever used pre-made encounters. I always make them fresh, like pie.
Have
What
you
do you
never
mean, like,
ran?
fresh like pie?
I make them up to be unique for the situation in the game.
Oh, okay. That this is weird because so I'll have a few set encounters. So let's say I want to tell like a specific story. I'll have like 3 or 4 just major plot point encounters or events that I have happen, and then interspersed throughout it, I'll have a bunch of random encounters that fit within the story that I'll have made, and I can throw in or take away depending upon if the story needs it or if the players like need it. So I'll have like my major plot points, and then I'll have a bunch of random encounters that I can throw in if it's going slowly, or I need to get them back on track, or I want to add in more stuff.
Yeah, I think well, let me ask this first to you guys. Have you guys ever ran a pre-made adventure before? Or are you guys kind of opposed to that?
Yes. No, I'm definitely not opposed to that. I ran, probably the last one I ran was The Lost Mines of Phandelver.
So did you just not use any of their encounters, or did you like edit those encounters?
If I recall, I think I just used them out of the book because they're quote unquote balanced for the party, even though the
But you said you never
can swing
used.
so quickly.
You say you always make your make your encounters yourself though?
Well, so most of my games that I run, I make up myself. My usage of
Mhm.
pre-made adventures is like I could probably count on one hand or maybe even two fingers. And when I run a pre-made adventure, I run their encounters. Otherwise, no.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
really use pre-made adventures, so
I think I use pre-made adventures frequently, but I love just having a skeleton to work with in regards to an encounter. So like I love, going through the Tomb of Annihilation and looking at each room and being like, how can I make this better?
Hmm.
Or, oh, this puzzle is kind of just stupid and would take a long time. It's gone. And
Yeah.
just edit the tomb as I go along. And so it's a lot of creative effort to build an entire mega dungeon yourself. But it's not as hard to have a pre-made thing in front of you that you could just edit and alter and tinker with to make it perfect for your specific party.
Hmm.
I don't know if it's that hard to make a dungeon pretty easily.
Not a dungeon. He's saying like an encounter. So
encounter.
If I'm following Jake,
like a
it sounds like
campaign.
you're saying, yeah. So being able to mix and match and remove things, especially like in the Tomb of Annihilation, like what's it called? What's it called in the adventure, Jake? The actual dungeon?
Or the Tomb
Kind
of the
the
Nine
Tomb of-
Gods.
Yeah, the Nine Gods. Because you know your players and you know what they're gonna like and dislike. So you're like, oh well, this is 3 puzzles back to back. That's not gonna work. Let's take one of these out and replace this with maybe something else.
Yeah.
Because obviously
Absolutely.
you know best.
Yeah, I feel like that gives it, I don't know, it gives you a little more leeway. I honestly
Mhm.
enjoy reading through older editions adventure modules. I don't like reading older editions rules. I just like going through the adventure modules and being like, ooh, how can I hack this up and bend it into a good, encounter for my table? It's just giving me more and more fuel for making future encounters.
That's really smart.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. If you want to not have to think about making an adventure or a campaign, just taking a pre-made one and altering it to what you think your players would like and what you would like, it's a great strategy. It's not hard to balance encounters. You just kind of, if you're familiar with 5e, you can easily shift the numbers around to make it a more feasible encounter if it is too high level for your players. And it's a simple and easy solution that is generally pretty good.
So I'm pretty lazy when it comes to creating encounters because I don't want to sit down and do the challenge rating calculations. And I did it one time and it took me probably an hour of just writing by hand. So now I go to donchan.com and he has an encounter builder for 5e and you can generate I think 50 at a time. So you choose the number of people
Oh,
in your
wow.
party and their level, and then you choose how difficult you want your encounter to be. And I think you can choose your environment type, and you just press go, and it'll just spit out more or less balanced encounters for that. And then I just pick my favorite one off of that list, and then you go, and then I can find out a reason to justify that group in the game. And it takes
That's
20
good.
seconds.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the combat as war versus combat as sport, how do you lean? Which side do you lean towards when building an encounter? Are you more focused on the sport aspect of your encounter or the combat as war aspect?
Okay, so I'll break it down like this. Combat as sport makes it so you're building balanced encounters, or as balanced as you can conceivably get to. Whereas combat as war is more interested in simulating a believable world. So I could say, oh, you're in the village and you go pick a fight with the town guard, and I figured you would, so I have only like 2 other guards come up and you fight them and you have a good time, right? And eventually you overcome them. Whereas if I'm simulating a world, you pick a fight with the guards and they will beat you unconscious and arrest you, and you had no chance of winning that because you should have known better. I also have a third one that I came up with just today about blending these two together, and that is having this open world zones that are simulated but at certain levels. So think of like World of Warcraft's zones where you know that everything in this area is safe for this level and so on and so forth. And so you can choose where you go without risking your life. Because sometimes it's not fun to be one shot by something.
So I know for me, I generally like to, when running 5e, I try to run it more combat as war, but I'll tend to adjust the stats of the monsters to fit the encounter. So if they're fighting, let's say I want to have them fight a mind flare or something.
Crazy.
I might tone down the mind flare if they're a really low level, but I really want that mind flare to be there for that encounter for whatever story-based reason. And it might still be a challenge, but it will be something that they can kind of overcome, just because I like to have
A chance of winning.
some chance of winning, because I think that one of the big things to do in one of the big problems of 5e is that there are some creatures which you just have zero chance of winning at if you're too low of a level. And I always like to have some hope, even if it is.
Wait, that's a problem of 5e? You just said
That
you
seems like a
run
problem
combat
of
as war.
game design.
Wait, that's a problem of game design?
No,
Shouldn't that
so
just
No,
be
that's a
how
problem
it
of
is,
like
though?
yes and no.
wait. So I'm confused. I thought David was defending combat as sport, but it sounds like you're actually a combat as war believer.
I am a
No,
combat
David
as
said
war
combat as
believer.
war.
What?
No, David said
No.
combat as war. Hold on. Let me get this straight. You said I like combat as war, but then you said some bad guys are too big and too powerful in 5e, and that's a flaw of the system because there's no hope for a lower level person. So, David, we need you to restart. I need to hear what you.
Okay, let
believe.
me.
Yeah, because that is objectively wrong.
So what I like to have in a D&D system is a more compact scale where you can, within reason, like still be able to fight a dragon if you're level 1.
Whoa.
Not necessarily like you are going to win the encounter, but like there is a chance that you could take it down. There's a chance.
Okay, so if I could put it this way. In a true combat as war scenario, the player's level 1, the dragon is a challenge rating 30, let's say. I don't think he actually is, but let's say. And the players go and fight that and they die. But David, he would make that dragon just be like a level 10, or maybe even a 5. Like, it's still probably going to kill them, but it's not definitely going to kill them.
Yeah, kind of. That for lack of a better explanation, kind of gets
Isn't
at
that
what I
more
like
combat
to
as
have.
sport then?
It seems more sporty.
I guess it is more sporty then, but I like to do it for like story reasons. Like, let's say you want to have a dragon.
Yeah.
And generally, if you are fighting a dragon at that level, there's going to be a reason why it is so weak, and not necessarily going to be.
That's true. It's not like an elder dragon comes down and they just somehow can defeat it. It's like, no, a young dragon is encountered in the woods for a story reason, and it's probably still going to eat them.
You lower
Yeah,
it.
generally I'll have a reason for the stat nerf.
Smart.
Yeah, and I think I like combat as sport more myself. I've talked about earlier kind of the debate of combat as sport versus combat as war. I kind of thought of a third way, and I'm like combat as cinema, CAC, which I just call the CAC. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. No, but
Combat as cinema? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah. So combat as cinema is basically like the rule of cool wins at the end of the day. So if a player goes, I want to do a front flip and then slam down on them with my sword, I'm gonna be like, oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I might even give you advantage. Because that's just, I feel like that's more valuable than a completely realistic world. Like, I play in a much more role-play, improv-heavy game, and the first rule of improv is never say no, always say yes and. And so, when someone does a crazy cool maneuver, like, you as a DM should be like, yes, and this happened. You shouldn't be like, I'm sorry, that's unrealistic in my world. Like that's just not as fun for me. So I tend to stick to combat as sport, and then kind of a subset of that's like combat as cinema. Like I want everything to be as tense
Balanced and fun.
and interesting and fun and exciting as it can be.
It's weird, but I've been really drawn to like the combat as cinema recently, just because I think it's fun to play around with, having a cinematic style combat where you shouldn't necessarily win, but you do, just because it's more cinematic that you do win. Mm-hmm. So while that is, I guess it is more combat as sport, it also, I like mixing the combat as war into the combat as cinema and just kind of having a mix of both of those. So while you are maybe fighting a lich at level 1, maybe you do some like really clever move where you have an item that counters his spell and turns it back on him and it kills him. and that's more cinematic, but that's harder to do in 5e in a strictly sports system.
Yeah, I think a perfect, all games are subjective, but I think the truth really does lie in the middle of these. I think blending them and knowing where to blend them makes a better game. Because, like, when I was running the Tomb of Annihilation game, all my players were going into the jungle, and, they're having to buy bug spray. And it's like, what? Like, that sounds like the most boring, mundane thing. But it's like they're heading into a dangerous, exotic, foreign jungle with like giant killer mosquitoes. Like, they're gonna need to buy expensive bug spray. And that totally fits into combat as war, as having like this believable encounters. But like, that kind of bookkeeping and that like kind of realistic drag on the game makes the game better because it makes it more immersive. And you're like, okay, this is a real scary jungle with real scary mad monkey diseases and stuff that we need to worry about. And so it kind of brings a little bit of like the more the realism into it, and it makes it better. But I think balancing between the sport and war of encounters is like what a dungeon master should really become best at, because that's like a really hard skill of like balancing those two.
Really knowing when to fade into more of a simulation as opposed to like just a fun encounter. You're right. It comes down to a lot of finesse and skill over time. Now, Jake, I have a question about your Tomb of Annihilation experience, Jake, because you're talking about your players buying bug spray and risking disease and all these things. But there's a lot of things, because I've been reading through Tomb of Annihilation as well, and I'm thinking, I don't know how much of this I would enforce in the game. So my question is, did you wind up doing things in that game that you wouldn't normally have chosen to do and found it to be rewarding or fun in a new and exciting way? Kind of a loaded
Absolutely.
question.
So I mean, cha-ching, like it is absolutely rewarding to flex your DM muscles in a way, because if I get lazy, it just turns into kind of an improv night, and like I really have to kind of like commit to a system in order to like create something new and interesting. So yeah, them going into the jungle and all of these weird kind of things that you don't think about while adventuring, like small injuries and dehydration and getting stuck in the mud and bug spray and like like all of these things really added so much to the game that I never would have just improvised into there. Because they are kind of cumbersome and there's a little more bookkeeping, but I think it did make the game more dire and it did make the game better. I think, for example, we just finished that Tomb of Annihilation game, and we're starting a new one that's just going to kind of be a quick homebrewed game called... so basically the tone is going to be if Quentin Tarantino directed Mad Max. And so I want it to be a very fun, bloody,
I would watch
deadly
that a lot.
game. Yeah, and so for me, my games are so sentimental and so dramatic and so, story-driven that, like, almost, when there's an encounter, I'm like, okay, this guy's not going to die to this trap in the tomb. Like deep down in my core, I'm just like, I'm not going to kill one of my players in a trap right now. That would be pathetic. and now I'm looking at that and I'm going, oh no, does that make me a worse dungeon master? So I'm going, okay, I want to stretch my muscles. And like I did with the tomb, I stretched myself and it became better. And so with this new campaign, I want it to be deadly and scary and just a bloodbath. So I'm telling my players, make sure you have extra characters lined up, not if, when your characters die. Because it's going to be a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And I really want to stretch my DM muscles and be like, no, be willing, no matter how cool or interesting or thematic or cinematic a character is, like, they can die at any time. And see if that changes how I play.
This sounds like it's just going to be Game of Thrones.
Okay.
And every episode's the Red Wedding.
Okay, so speaking of Game of Thrones, I was just trying to figure out a way to put this in here. I think that D&D, when you're playing the way Jake is describing, this Tarantino Mad Maxian world, when there's real risk that a main character can die, then every encounter becomes life or death.
Deadly.
And it becomes so much more interesting. It could be deadly. So when you're watching Game of Thrones... and you're seeing a main character in a fight, and you've just seen so many more characters die in the past seasons, and you're like, they might die, like in this stupid battle, like under a windmill, right? or they step in a trap and they get an infection because of their broken foot, and they just like succumb to monkey sickness and die screaming.
And it's like, wow, like I
Yeah.
didn't know, like my cool like BA character could just like die randomly like that.
I think that's really special. I guess this is a great time to talk about a variant rule I saw relating to because if the world's that deadly, then you always want to be full health. And I saw a guy online make the medicine skill when you do a short rest. If somebody does a medicine skill over a certain DC on you, then you get to max out some hit dice on your roll. And I thought that was such a clever and very minimal system for actually
that's a
making that skill
great
useful.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think going back to your original question, though, I think it's very important for DMs to stretch their muscles because, like, what you were talking about earlier about exploration and you not seeing really how it's a big part, like a big pillar. For me, in playing Tomb of Annihilation, like exploration was just downright essential, and so that from now on, because I played that and because I stretched myself and flexed my DM muscles, I'm going to value exploration more from here on out. And so I'm hoping with this new crazy post-apocalyptic campaign that I will value deadly encounters more from here on out.
I think that's great.
So we talked about having combat as war, combat as cinema, and combat as sport all blended together. What do you think are the most important things to take away from each one of those categories when building an encounter?
Ooh,
Wow.
okay.
The most
That's a good
important
question.
columns.
So,
Or what should
I'd say
you,
from
when designing an encounter with all three of those in mind, what are some of the things that you want to take note of each of those categories?
so sport, you're looking for fairness. I think this is where all of the CR ratings, I think, the challenge ratings in 5e, they're kind of like, okay, we got to get this as fair as we can. I think that's where that comes in. I think believable worlds from Combat as War is everything has to be tonally correct. And so if your world does have things like diseases or an estranged wife or civilian casualties, all of those things have to be thrown in to encounters, and you can't shy away from them. You have to be willing to let some pretty bad things happen. And I think in Combat as War mostly you have to be willing to run away as a player. You have to see things be like, oh crap, we got to get out of here. And that doesn't happen in Combat as Sport.
That's true. Like, and I think that's responsible for, and I think that's the underlying reason why so many D&D players have never, and probably will never, run from a combat, because they know that it's designed for them to win.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I just realized that. Holy crap, yeah. Like, why would they run when they know the DM is trying to balance it? Oh, that's so weird.
And like you're saying, Jake, that sense of empowerment, or even like just the thrill of lethality, it changes the way you DM. Because, I mean, I know that I have pulled punches and I have not done the coup de grace to annihilate a player, even when a creature absolutely would have just stomped on the cleric's head and moved on to the battle. You know, he should have. Because in Combat as War, if you're, I say simulating loosely, but all that it means is it's cause and effect. And it's people making decisions for themselves in a way that the DM is not trying to influence. Like, I'm not trying to win, but this captain of the guard really would just put you in prison and then starve you to death until you die, for months.
And that's why I think Combat as Cinema, you know, it kind of bridges the gap and it kind of gives a third option, because when you're watching something, when you're in a cinema, when you're watching a movie, you are basically enjoying it. But at the same time, if something ridiculous happens, it breaks your immersion and it's not as fun. And so that's why if you're trying to run a more serious game, like Combat as Cinema almost supports war, because it's like, oh yeah, if this guy didn't crush my head when he should have, like, yeah, my immersion's kind of broke. Like, this game is a little more of a game and less of like a real thing that we're immersed in.
Yeah. So for me, when I want to look at all of three of these types to make sure that I have a well-rounded encounter, so I'll probably start with the Combat as Cinema. So what creature would fit best in the story? So if you're dealing with undead, maybe you have an undead minotaur that fits in. And then I would go in and ask myself, in a combat as war scenario, why is this Minotaur there? Like, where did it come from? Kind of get the logical reasoning for it to be placed in the world. And then finally, I will say, how do I balance this and make sure that the encounter is going to either be steer away the players away from fighting this, or if they are going to fight this, how do I make sure that it is at least a somewhat fair fight?
Yeah.
So in a like a 5e system, that would be my method of going through all of these things and making sure that the encounter is balanced.
One of my most... Okay, so the question was, what's the most important between these all three?
It was like, how do you include them all together to make a
For a balanced encounter?
Balanced encounter.
So I think that I'm going to choose option D here. And that is terrain and environment is so crucial to having really interesting encounters. And I'm very guilty of just having a flat, featureless field, and there's an enemy at one side, and there's the party on the other, and then the party wins. And it was boring, and you just roll dice a lot. And so yeah, and definitely your environment. Terrain changes everything.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the most undervalued parts of encounter making. Because when you're crafting an encounter, you're mostly thinking about enemies and fairness and like, okay, does the challenge rating make sense? Or okay, could they defeat them? Or what ways does the monster have to run? But it's like, if you put a standard, like David was like, we'll say a Minotaur attacking a party, and you put that in an active volcano, like it changes everything. It makes it, and I know you can't insert an active volcano into any encounter you have, but you should always be thinking about the environment. You should think about, is there places for the ranged characters to get into cover? Are there pitfalls? Are there parts of the environment that could harm either the players or the enemies if they somehow fell into them or were sucked into them?
Yeah.
And so I think looking at the environment is just essential, and it's often neglected when you're thinking about an encounter.
So it's you said a active volcano, but I would argue that even fairly mundane terrain features can be really interesting. So let's take our Minotaur, our undead Minotaur, and let's give him a whole bunch of smaller, maybe goblins, something with ranged attacks. And we just put him on the side of the field, the far side, and we have a huge river, like a 20 or 30 foot wide river cutting the battlefield in half. And so now the players have to get over there. And so that's going to change the way the players can even use their skills. Because the slower people having to cross that, they might not even get to engage in battle for the first 3 rounds. Yeah. And the fast people and the ranged people, they'll be zipping across in no time. And so, like Jake's saying, you want to sort of consider things for the player characters to do. But also, if you just have terrain features, you don't necessarily need to think about what they're going to do. You just think, here's the way the world is. Like maybe you have a battle that is just surrounded by those huge termite mounds, like in Africa.
Oh.
You know, the ones that are like 5 feet tall.
Yeah.
And you just have a battle there and see what happens.
Huh. Yeah, because it logically, like if you trust your own mind's, like, you know, if-then logic and improvisation, like, yeah, you don't even have to think about possibilities or like writing out hypotheticals. It's like, no, like it's just this cool place where cool things can happen, and just trusting yourself as a DM to see what happens. I love that.
Or you have even just having like stalactites and stalagmites in your cave.
Yeah.
Like let's say they're fighting and they try to knock some of them off from the ceiling to like fall down and kill the enemies. That's a cool interaction that wouldn't have happened if you didn't describe those in your environment.
Yeah.
I think
it's delightful to me.
Two very easy additions to an environment are, one, a chandelier. I think it just provides a very easy way for someone to roll acrobatics and attack something from above, or to dodge out of the way and swing on the chandelier out of the way. Super easy, especially if you're indoors or in a dungeon or in, you know, a city or something. A chandelier is a great addition. The second one is some sort of explosive, whether it's like a small, like, magical orb of destruction, or whether it's just a, you know, bottle of fine liquor. Or even if it's like a big barrel of, you know, some sort of alcohol that could blow up. All of those things add kind of a tension, kind of something that could happen where it could, you know, change the situation entirely. And really I want to reward the people that listen to my descriptions of rooms, and I want to reward creative people who can use the environment to their advantage.
Yeah.
So they're almost like Easter eggs, but they
I love
actually
that.
aren't, because like they should be viewed as like something you can use.
So I'm like just talking about this is making me really want to run a combat encounter on a ship.
Like a sailing
Oh,
ship?
yeah.
Or
Yeah, like a
Yeah.
sailing ship. So I'm just imagining you guys are below decks, and there's this guy who you're just trying to fight. But as the ship's rocking back and forth, some of the barrels fall over, and now they become obstacles that the players have to either try to dodge out of the way of, or maybe they can push the enemy in front of some of the barrels that are rolling back and forth as they're fighting. So just creating a more dynamic environment where it feels more interesting because there are different things that you have to take in account of as you're fighting.
Okay, I'm going to ramp that up a little bit and say it is a combat encounter in the belly of a ship during a naval battle.
Oh,
And so you have cannonballs ripping through the walls. You have maybe the ship is sinking like once you get halfway through the battle, and so like you're going
okay.
up above decks. Like there's such cool things you can do, and all you've done is you've introduced a well, I was going to say realistic, but like a Hollywood realistic scene where you know what's going to happen. You know
Combat
what
is
can
cinema.
happen. And you didn't have to write down anything. You said it takes place on a ship in a battle.
rather than like you guys just start stabbing each other back and forth and having no dynamic nature of the ship. Like it's if you don't incorporate those aspects, it's like why even fight on a ship in the first place?
Yeah, it's bone dry, and it's got character and flavor, and man, we should just write down
So
whole
many
bunch of
options.
interesting
Yeah.
things. So as Dave is saying, it's important to at least consider if your encounter is hard, easy, or deadly. Personally, I make all my encounters hard. I'm not interested in having easy because I have so little time to play D&D, and when I do play, I have so little time to play D&D. I don't want to waste time fighting 5 goblins, and that's like 45 minutes that nothing really happened.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to bring out this big heavy hitter and his minions, and you're going to really fight for your life, and it's going to be great. But I don't do deadly because as much as I advocate as much as I advocate combat as war and just really being simulationist in a lot of ways, I don't just want to kill people. I don't want them to die.
Yeah.
Usually.
I think in a campaign I'm running right now, it's one of my like introductory campaigns. It's like kind of my homebrewed Rise of Tiamat, and these some of my players stumbled upon an island, and there were all these like dead trees sticking out of it, and then suddenly the island started raising, and they realized they were on the back of a massive ancient green dragon. And so I've done this encounter for I think 4 different adventuring parties, and I've had some that were just like, oh my, we gotta go, and they just sprint away, and I'm me as the DM, I'm thinking, good job. I have other ones who are like, oh, can we take this? And then I have others who are just like, I start stabbing in its back, and so
my
I basically
God.
at that point I have
Turtle
to
shells were
basically,
designed for stabbing.
and so essentially I have to. I think the worst case scenario, I had to look at someone and be like, roll wisdom with advantage. And they roll like a 16. I'm like, yeah, you know that this thing will destroy all of you guys very easily. And so then that person goes, guys, we should run, And so like bottom line, I think if you do introduce a deadly encounter, I think you should very, very effectively convey how deadly it is.
Oh yeah,
Whether
foreshadowing.
that's kind of
You must
like
foreshadow.
you shouldn't just have like this random troll that has like a weird blunderbuss, gunpowder rifle that he shoots at someone and it completely kills them in one shot. It's like, okay, like that's a deadly encounter, but like they weren't expecting that. That's not cinematic. That's not fun.
Yeah.
And so deadly encounters you have to be careful with.
I always like to warn my players when having a deadly encounter by just showing them easily defeat an enemy that was a challenge for them. So like let's say
That's
they
such a
fight
smart
they
idea.
fought an owlbear and it was a pretty tough fight. And then they go up and they're just watching this ogre and he just walks up to this owlbear and rips it in half. And they're just like, well, maybe we shouldn't fight this guy.
Oh, that's
really
such
good.
I think that's really effective because I think now that I'm looking back, I had a campaign I ran where there was like a demon invasion, but all these demons had like their demon lord had crafted gunpowder for the first time. So it was the introduction of gunpowder to the world. So there's all these demons running around with like primitive muskets. And this archmage, like one of the head NPCs, is like, okay guys, we need to do this, we need to do this, and suddenly his head blows up.
Oh my
And
god.
he was just shot, and like he was killed by like just a random musket ball, and like it really set the tone of like, okay, this game is darker, and now gunpowder is introduced onto the world stage, and it is powerful. And so it really did the job of being like yeah, you need to run. These things are scary and deadly, and it will not be a fair fight if you try.
Jeez. It's like magic missiles for the whole world. When building encounters, consider your players' resources. So think of their remaining health, their spell slots, whatever it is that they use in any given battle. I've heard of this idea of you're going through this layer, the big boss's layer, and just before you get to the big boss's layer, you have a grand fight with dozens of minions. There's a couple of big heavy hitters in there that more or less expend everything the players have just to defeat it. And they do defeat it because it was balanced correctly. But then they go into the next room and you have like the Pirate King. And he's just like one guy. Maybe he has a little minion. And he's a pretty low level threat. Like he's an easy level threat. But they have nothing to defeat him. And so at this point, you've changed the combat rating just due to the lack of resources.
That's interesting. I like that. One of the other things that I like to do is throughout playing your game, you're going to notice your players tend to pick up a certain pattern of fighting enemies. So, like, let's say they always have the tank in the front who always initiates, and the rogue always sneaks up behind, and the wizard always casts this spell. And they have a pattern, and it gets pretty predictable. So what I like to do is throw in creatures that disrupt the pattern of combat that they normally do. So let's say they rely on this magic fireball wand all the time. Well, now they're fighting a beholder that has a no magic zone. So when you shoot the fireball at it, it just dissipates and nothing happens. So it forces them to adapt and yeah, it's not only horrifying, but it forces them to adapt and fight in a different way that they normally do. And it makes the encounter more interesting because it's engaging them critically. And they're like, well, this sucks, so how are we going to defeat this guy when we can't use our big fireball wand?
And I think spells in general can be used to really put wrinkles into combat.
Yes.
There was a post I saw on Reddit today about the anti-life shell spell. And you put that on an enemy who can attack 15 feet away, like a large creature with reach. And all of a sudden, your melee attackers cannot hurt that boss, that creature. So they can't even get close to it. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so smart. Because so often, David, I have had bosses who have been one-shot before he even got a chance to react. And the campaign was just kind of over in one shot.
That leads into another question of how adjustable are you guys with encounters? Are you willing to change stats on the fly, or are you like, nope, this is combat as war, this is what the encounter is, good luck? Or do you change stuff on the fly? What do you guys do?
Are you saying, like, do we balance the game live during play?
As it's going, yeah, live balancing. Yeah.
100% yes. I think that I'm more focused on the tone of the game and the flow rather than whether or not this is, according to the rules, a balanced encounter. So if I feel like they're blowing through a boss too quickly, I might add a few extra HP just to slow them down.
That's crap, David.
But if I only do it if it fits the story. Or I'll do it the other way. Let's say they're really struggling against a boss or an enemy that they shouldn't. I'll make it easier, just because I'm more focused on the story that is being told than the actual fight and whether or not it is a fair duel to the death.
That's interesting. How you dance between. I think you kind of hate combat as war, David, secretly, but you won't admit it.
I think he does.
Maybe I do.
It's like his mouth says yes, but his heart says
My
no.
mouth says yes, my heart says no.
So for it depends on the tone of the game that I'm going for. If I'm playing D&D with a bunch of first timers who I'm really trying to get into the hobby, I'm definitely going to pull punches. I'm going to have the enemy just retreat or flee, or they get routed by the knights show up and save the day. But if I'm really clear up front with my players and I'm saying, look, this is a dangerous world and you could die. And so for the last 3 games I've run, I've said that at the start of the game. And it just frees me to not have to think about that. The problem is that all of the players are better tacticians than I am. And so even though I'm throwing hard encounters at them all the time, they just wipe the floor with them. So I need to probably just pick deadly encounters, come to think of it.
Yeah, because I think that's something I've noticed with, I don't know, over the past few sessions, is that it's better to create deadly encounters and then lower the difficulty as they're playing and as it gets close, as someone goes down, that's better than having it maybe an easier or like just a standard like hard encounter and then upping it as you go along. It's much easier to have a deadly encounter that you lower to even out and meet them in the middle than it is to buff a monster mid-fight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because like if they're fighting a bunch of goblins and they're like, wow, these guys have like hundreds of hit points, you're like, yeah, they're tough. But if they're fighting like 3 basilisk, and you're like, yeah, the 3 of you are stone, and 2 of them just like turn and run away, or even they forget to do their multi attack, or they forget to do the stone gaze.
Yeah, because I doubt people
easy.
are paying attention. Yeah, to the amount of actions you're doing or whatever. And so, yeah, I think the easiest way to alter is I don't alter health. Mostly I will just give them an extra action or make their attack do a little more damage. That's pretty much all I do. I don't like to change the health much unless like someone lands a really cool blow and it leaves them with like 2 health left. I'm like, okay, they die. I'm not going to make them come over to a crippled enemy and slit its throat unless that would be even better.
Well, in the Mad Max world that you're running, maybe they would.
Oh, it's going to be a bloodbath.
Oh, jeez.
So as for balancing the game, what are some tips for balancing the game, encounter-wise?
That's a tough question because...
we talked about like in terms of combat as war and sport and so on. But I'm saying like I just want to build an encounter. How do I make sure it's fair?
Well... It really depends upon what you would define as fair and what you want out of the encounter. Do you want the combat to challenge the players? Are you wanting them to feel scared? Like, do you want them to fear for their life? Do you want them to be more cinematic and a more story focused moment in your game? I think those are things that you need to kind of take note of in terms of balancing it to make sure that you're focusing on the right things. If you want a deadly encounter, maybe the mob or the creature that they're fighting is a little stronger than he normally is, just to get the point across that this is a deadly fight. Or maybe you focus on the creature having more HP, so you're interacting with it for a longer period of time because it has some interesting features about it, like the basilisk.
Mm-hmm. So my life hack, I don't know where Jake went, but my life hack is...
Oh, no, I'm here.
Action economy is the king of D&D 5e. Like you could have a boss who is a deadly encounter all by himself, and you can have the heart of the volcano, whatever environment you want. But if he only gets 1 action a turn, he may be one-shotting PCs every turn. But chances are he's going to miss a couple times. And your players will have 5 turns for every one of his, and he will go down. And the GM will be scratching his head saying, like, what did I do wrong? Or you could throw 20 goblins at a group of, like, 4 or 5 players. And you have 20 actions there, 5. And even though they're just... really not very accurate and they don't do a lot of damage, you can annihilate like a 5th level party, maybe not 5th, like a 3rd level party pretty easily just by out turning them. And if you keep that in mind, it'll make it a lot easier to build encounters. If you're gonna build a big boss who's just like a solo thing, you definitely have to just beef up their actions. An easy way to do it is you just make them go after every player goes. That'll put the fear into them.
Well, I think that in most boss fights, like most legendary creatures, I think 5th edition is they know this. They're not dumb, the designers, and they've given a lot of layer actions and legendary actions, which are pretty incredible, and it balances out the action economy pretty well. I guess from running some big bosses recently, like, yeah, some of those legendary actions are horrifying. And it's just like they will strike fear into the people that happen to wander into this boss's lair. It is some of them are really great. So yeah, I think actions are kind of king in regards to balance, like the action economy. Like if you want to balance an encounter, give them another action, or give them reactions. A lot of times, especially new players, don't really understand what a reaction is, but just throw in some reactions. If one of the best fighters slashes them, have them attack back. I don't think anyone at your table is going to complain and be like, wait, he's taken more actions than he should have taken. It'll make the fight better. If you know the balance yourself, I think you can do the math well enough in your head to give an action here or there to make the fight more balanced. Yeah.
Yeah. Though I would encourage DMs to be really consistent with that ruling. Don't just have your villain suddenly gain 3 more turns for no reason. You always have 3 turns, and you just decide to use them or not. And this way, it's not feeling unfair, because you don't want your players to feel like you're being combative. Because obviously, as a GM, if we wanted to kill our players, we just could. But a lot of people I play with, or at least a few of them, they actually do get bent out of shape if they feel I'm cheating.
Yeah,
you know who you are.
What?
You do need to make sure that you are consistent with how you run a creature. So if they act a certain way, they're always going to act that way, or act in a similar manner that makes sense within your world.
Mm-hmm. Like you can just make goblins always call for help. Like when they get down to a certain number, they always call for help, and it always brings more goblins. And you just so the players know that is a rule in my world, and it's going to happen.
Huh. I guess that this leads into another rabbit hole of like deep trust in your dungeon master. Like if your dungeon master does something, is like, I'm going to give him an extra attack. What player is going to be like, no? Like, do you think the dungeon master wants you to have a bad time? Like, they're doing this to make you have a better time.
You're right. And Jake, I agree with you, but I must reiterate that you have the best players who have ever played D&D.
Yeah, I guess, man, you're right. Thanks, guys, if you're listening.
Yeah, you're spoiled to death.
How has your prep and your process for creating encounters changed?
Ooh, that's good. Jake?
I think for me, it has been tailoring my encounters to the specific party. I basically have a few campaigns that I have run through with multiple parties to the point where I'm so comfortable that I know what happens next mission. I know what happens next session, blah, blah, blah. Like I'm so prepared, but I've gotten better at being able to curate those specific environments or encounters to let every player shine. Like if I have a player that can breathe underwater or has boots of water walking, then I'll include a pool of water in the encounter. Or if I have a rogue that's incredibly acrobatic, then I will have maybe strings of lights or maybe clotheslines hung over the urban encounter so he can balance on those and walk between rooftops. Just adding little things that allows each individual player to shine, I think is just what I have learned to be better at.
That is some of the best dungeon master advice I think we've had on this show. Jake is putting his players' enjoyment at the forefront of everything he's considering and doing. I think that I don't do this as much as I should, because I don't even look at my players' character sheets half the time because I just have so much crap going on. I don't care.
The main way that I've just changed is the quality of my prep has gone up significantly over time. The more I play, the more I know exactly what I need and what I don't. So, for example, I know if I'm going to have this monster, I'm going to need the stats. So I always have the monsters that I'm going to have the party encounter, how they act, what's the environment, and what are their stats. And that's pretty much all I have written down. Everything else is either like improv, or I have a rough idea in my head of how it's going to play out, but I only keep what I need, and that really helps reduce the amount that I have to prep and reduce the wasted prep that normally in the past I would have had.
That I think that's a
remember-
fantastic answer, because like most new DMs, they're told over and over again, you don't need that much to play. You don't need to over prepare. But they don't know what they need to prepare. And it's different for each table. And so I think playing the game, that's what you get better at as a DM, is realizing what you need, what you don't need to make encounters shine.
I'm a big fan of optimizing DM prep, and even better, like what you have at the table to play. There's a picture that Mike Merles posted on Twitter, I think last year, of him DMing a game, and his DM screen was these tables. I think they're in the DMG, but I can't find them. And it has the monster health by level for like from like 1 CR 1/4 to 30, I think. How much damage they would do, and something else like special abilities. And so at any time you can just look at your tables, say, okay, it should be about this level, this is how much damage and health it should have. And then you don't even need to open your monster manual, you just look and you go. And I think that tool would be more useful in the hands of an experienced GM. Like if you're starting out, that would make a lot of sense. But I want that DM screen.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, I want that. Where is it?
It's all you need. I'll find the tweet and we'll find the tables.
So a final thing that I would be remiss to not mention is social encounters, and how these can be made exceptional. Oftentimes we think encounters, we think combat, but like the social pillar of encounters can be incredible. So what are some tips that you guys have for running social encounters, how to make them more interesting, how to make them more severe, like give them consequences? Like what are some tips you guys have?
Ooh. So the first one that comes to mind is I would run it like a skill challenge. Like let's say you're going into a royal court and you're having to make a bid or some kind of plea to the person in charge to get what you want. And you need to just overcome their disagreements. Otherwise, they will get what they want and you won't. So that's one idea. I'm very curious to hear what Jake would say on this, but David, go. Psych!
I love the idea of having ramifications for failing social encounters. Too often, it's I try to convince this person to give me this item for free. Well, I fail, and then you just walk away, and nothing happens. I like the dynamic changing. So let's say you're trying to get this guy to sell you an item for a lower price, and now he distrusts you, or he has his eye on you, or he's told the guards to keep an eye on you because you don't want to pay for this item. Or there's just some sort of slightly negative response that just changes the interaction rather than you didn't get you Ray or nothing happens.
I have a idea for kind of a half-baked homebrew where your characters have a social damage stat, like a weapon stat, based on your charisma and maybe some other factors. And so every social, like intelligent humanoid in the game has a certain amount of like social health that you have to overcome if you were going to convince them of something. And that way you could have the whole party kind of wearing down a person, but then also that person is wearing you down socially, like your social health as well. So I don't know how it would work, but I like the idea of having sort of a resource that you're having to maintain.
No, that's interesting. I think for me, my advice almost, as much as I am kind of the champion of social encounters, my advice for this almost is for all encounters. It is add a timer. So say you're infiltrating a vampire ceremony, and you're deceptively a vampire, maybe you actually are a vampire, and somehow you got to finish this before the sun rises. Okay. Or maybe there's an encounter where the Thieves Guild or some bad entity has set up a bomb, like an orb of destruction that will go off at this certain time, and you have to either get the bomb to a place where it can blow up safely, or you have to somehow disarm it, or somehow get rid of that problem, but there's a timer. You can't just say, "Oh, I need to take a long rest to get my spells back." No, like there is a direct problem. Another common one is a ritual that's happening, and if enough of these cultists finish that ritual, then they will summon some sort of undead enemy, or some sort of demon from the underworld, and so all of those things have timers on them. And so whenever you're looking at a scenario, maybe you're building an encounter and you go, it's good, but I don't know, like, if there's enough that is urging them to address the problem. Add a timer. Something I did when I finished the Tomb of Annihilation was my players were going through it, and in order for them not to take down an enemy and then take a long rest and then go into the next room, address that puzzle or challenge or trap, and then take a long rest. What I did was I had another entire group of bad guys that were basically the evil empire that was coming, that wanted to take the tomb for themselves. They were just brute forcing their way with newly made warforged like robots, and they're just brute forcing their way through the tomb behind the adventuring party. So the adventuring party oftentimes couldn't sleep, they couldn't rest, they had to keep pressing on because these things were right on their tails. And it made the Tomb of Annihilation even scarier because they had a timer as well as the standard, crap they had to deal with. So adding a timer can help almost any encounter.
Wow. So I haven't had a chance to talk about it in this episode, but I want to talk about my favorite encounter. Most effective encounter was there was a portal in the plane of mud, one of the elemental planes, and it was a bunch of portals that opened up underneath the kingdom, so everything is like shifting into this swampy plane.
Oh my god.
And so everybody is trying to close these portals, and so they had this very cool hero, I think he was like a lieutenant of the Mages Guild or something. And they had to protect him as he's closing the portal. And there was a timer on it. So I think I was counting down from a D6 or something. So in 6 rounds, it'll be gone. And there's just swarms, like these relentless waves of monsters. And these monsters only have 1 HP. In every other way, they are a full-blown monster. They deal full damage and everything. But when you roll, if you roll to hit, then they die, period. So it saves a lot of time on rolling damage. And so the players realized that all of their skills were optimized for single target damage. And so they're swinging like a truck at one little balloon enemy, right? And they pop, but there's like 18 more. And so they were just getting swarmed. And eventually...
they didn't have any AoE.
These things are also... Yeah, and the monsters are also attacking the guy who's closing the portal. And he has health, and he is dying, and he can die. Eventually, they were able to save him, but there were so many enemies between them and like being able to get back into the real world. The portal closed with the hero guy inside of it. And it was just this great moment, and the combat was relentless. Fantastic.
That's so great.
That's
so
awesome.
I think that proves a great example of the whole timer thing. Mm-hmm. You can also flip it and make the timer not be on the bad guys doing something or a bomb going off. Make it about your players surviving a certain amount of rounds until reinforcements arrive. Yeah. Or making it about like they have to do this thing in a certain amount of time for themselves in order for them to be saved, or in order for them to teleport out of there, or in order for the ritual to be cast, in order to get them to the right plane of existence.
Yes.
Like, man, timers help so much.
And I think that having the mindset of what would an encounter look like if the goal was not to kill the enemy, and then you think of all kinds of different things you can do in that space. Yeah. Or run away, all the things we're talking about. There's so many cool things you can do. And so often it's not even considered as far as I've seen.
Yeah, I'm even thinking of just like a adventuring party just trying to hide, and they have to hide for 6 rounds.
Oh.
And that would be great. Just have the monster sniffing around and them rolling checks and saying what they're doing.
It's like that video game where you're with the alien on the ship and you're just hiding from it the whole time. Or maybe you're
Alien
like
Isolation.
Yes.
I'm thinking of like Lord of the Rings with the ring wraiths.
Yes.
Where you're just like, these guys are just on you and you gotta hide
just
whenever
holding
they
your
show
breath.
up.
And so you make them, like the whole party has to succeed like 3 stealth checks back to back.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily fun because it's just like rolling dice, but the intensity is awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Welcome to Random Table Talk. This is our new segment in which we are going to generate something from random tables. This week we are creating encounters using tables found in the Dungeon Master's Guide and Xanathar's Guide to Everything. All right, I guess we're teaming up on this. So I will let Jake do the first decision. Would you like an exotic location or a weird location in which to have our encounter?
What is the difference? Oh, man.
They are very different, apparently.
I'm going to say exotic.
Oh, all right.
Here we go.
David, give me a D20 roll.
19.
That gives us sealed inside a magic dome of force.
Ooh.
That's interesting.
Whoa,
Okay, so we know it's...
That's cool. Okay.
Already, it's something I would have literally never thought of.
Exactly.
All right,
So
we're going to get a
contained.
monument. It is contained. We're going to get a monument that is like a terrain feature inside of this. Jake, give me a D20 roll.
D20, we'll say 17.
A fountain. All right.
Okay.
So it sounds like
Oh,
we're
I
in
like
an
that.
urban environment. Yeah. And there's like this magical duel happening. There's a dome around everyone.
What if the fountain is creating the dome?
Magical artifact.
Oh, no,
all right,
I really like that. Or can we just go?
It's just like a magical fountain.
Yeah, let's go with it.
So I like the idea of this fountain creating kind of a magical, like I imagine a fountain where it like, it shoots up and then it kind of puts down like almost an imitation of what's above. And so it's putting down kind of this dome of the fountain, and you look up and the dome is created from this magical fountain. So you got to find some way to maybe plug up the fountain or stop the fountain
Because it's filling with water.
Yeah, while it's filling up, and there's got to be some aquatic monsters that are getting stronger as it fills up.
Oh, that's great. So maybe there's something in the sewer that is crawling out, and a mage went to block off this like sewer invasion, but the players were stuck inside, and there's also a fountain in there, and now so the sewer is full. And now we're flooding the dome, and there's really powerful creatures who thrive in water. So you've got a timer in the form of a ticking, like filling the dome. And this is weird but good.
So I
do you
like
get
this
out of
because
that?
it has the three pillars, right? So the first pillar is exploration, and it's going to be trying to find a way to problem solve a way to plug up the water. The other pillar is combat, where you have your best fighters just fighting against whatever these. I'm thinking maybe they're water weirds or water elementals attacking you. And then the last one is social, where maybe the bard is banging against this invisible wall and is yelling at the mage, trying to convince him to open it up as it's filling with water. And the mage has this kind of moral dilemma of, do I just let them die to stop this, or do I open it up? So
and
it's
then you
all
can have a
three of those
spellcaster
at
trying
once.
to counterspell it at the same time. So you've kind of
to
taken
get out.
somebody out of the battle, which is also like limiting their resources. This is a really good encounter. And we just rolled it up. This is great.
Wow.
That concludes our first ever random table talk. We're going to be doing this pretty regularly, I think. So if you have an idea for some random tables you want us to use, send them to us at voxarcanapodcast@gmail.com. Let's go to the vault. This week's vault question: how do you deal with GM burnout? So just quickly, GM burnout is when you're tired of playing D&D and your whole game suffers and your players suffer and you don't really want to play it anymore.
From my experience, if you don't want to play D&D, don't play D&D.
Drop the mic.
As weird as that sounds, sometimes it's good to take a break. I think that some of the things that can help, I guess, cure your GM burnout is getting inspiration. So listening to podcasts or reading blogs that approach D&D in a different way than you have. Maybe playing the game instead of running it. Being a part of a campaign could be really fun and interesting. Just kind of experience, or even listening to other campaigns like Critical Role and things like that, that might inspire you to want to run your own game.
I find that getting out of the fantasy genre is just incredibly helpful for me. Typically, I'll go into sci-fi or even the Weird West kind of settings. There's just cool stories there, and it makes you think about situations differently than you would in fantasy. Like, what happens if everybody has walkie-talkies. Communication is not an issue anymore, or laser guns, or shields. It's a totally different set of problems, even though they're pretty similar in a lot of ways mechanically to D&D. It just opens your brain up to do new things. But also, everything David said is really good, especially playing in someone else's campaign. Nothing will invigorate you and make you realize like what you want to do quite like that.
I guess for me, how I deal with GM burnout is I don't, because I've never felt it.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. All right, Sensei.
Like,
wait, you've never even got close.
I don't think so. But I think what you said, I just have kind of a fairy tale of like great players. And I often think GM burnout, like when you're burnt out from being a dungeon master, I think most of the time it doesn't come from the system or the amount of time you're playing. I think it comes from your table. And so if you're dealing with a bunch of just jerks, or, a thief that's pickpocketing, all of his party members, or just people who don't get along, that's going to be taxing on you. And I think a lot of burnout doesn't come from the system or the genre or the game. It comes from your table. And so maybe you do need to take a break, or maybe try a different table. Try just being like, I want to start a new game. Maybe play with, I know everyone who's listening has a group of friends that has not played D&D before. Try hosting one session with them. And that would be, maybe a way to break out of that and realize like, oh, there are a bunch of different types of players. And maybe my table's full of players that just might exhaust you.
Yeah, I actually think that that's a great point, is try to identify why you're burnt out. What are you frustrated with? What is tiring you from playing D&D? Are you frustrated with combat? Are you frustrated with your players? Are you frustrated because you feel like your story isn't going well? Those are all things that you can identify and help try to fix. And trying to adapt and make your game more fun for you to run is going to help you avoid burning out.
Yeah.
Dang.
Absolutely.
You guys are so wise. I love it. Well, that is this week's Question Vault. Starting this week, I want to start reading our favorite 5-star reviews from iTunes. And here's one I like a lot. This is from someone named And Also Thomas. He says 5 stars. Thoroughly enjoyable discussion and also pretty accessible for those who haven't played. Thanks, And Also Thomas. This means someone who has not played is listening to our show.
Whoa, that's we gotta be doing something, right?
That's great. Well, if you want to have a chance of having your review read on the show, give us a 5-star review on iTunes, please and thank you. Thank you for listening to Vox Arcana episode 15. I'm William.
I'm Jake.
And I'm David.
We'll see you next time. You can follow us on social media. Our Twitter is @VoxArcanaPod. Our Facebook and Instagram are @VoxArcanaPodcast. And you can email us your questions, comments, and concerns at VoxArcanaPodcast@gmail.com. You're not weird. Everyone else is.